Melanie is with us from Strum Consulting. She's a senior ecology lead, and she's going to deliver a presentation this morning on wetlands and watercourses. So please help me welcome Melanie. I should also say at the end of each presentation, we're welcoming questions you might have. There'll be a microphone that we'll take around the room.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, this is bright up here. I'm excited to be here and chat with you guys today. Quick agenda for us. We're going to run through a little introduction of myself and our company. I'm going to go through definition, policy, and delineation wetland types for wetlands, and then for watercourses, similar kind of framework with definition, policy, and guidance for you guys. So a little bit about me. I did an undergrad in biology and interdisciplinary studies in aquatic resources at St. FX. After that, I moved to Fort McMurray and spent 5 years as a regulatory and environmental specialist in the oil sands, doing all kinds of construction monitoring and water management, a lot of fish and wildlife work. I moved back home and did my master's degree in resource and environmental management at DAL, and through that program, I did an internship with McCallum Environmental. At the time, McCallum was just the two owners, a brother and sister-in-law combo. We've become family now. So I ended up staying on to work with them. I started in 2011. And I stayed there until last year when Strum purchased McCallum. So our whole team moved over, and by that time, the McCallum team had grown from 3 when I joined to about 35. And so we've joined another team of biologists, about 35 in size. So now we've got a really great group of about 70 biologists working for Strum. My roles in both companies are pretty similar. I started at McCallum as, the only other person there, so I did all of the field work, we basically write environmental assessments, and we support clients on permitting and construction, wetland alteration applications, and watercourse alteration applications. I mention this because septic design is not really my thing. My thing leads into septic design. But I'm an ecologist, and I was the person who would walk the landscapes. I spent many years bushwhacking by myself in the woods, mapping out all of the wetlands and watercourses, doing moose and turtle and fish surveys, bird surveys, botany. But I would say I am at heart a wetland girl. I love my wetlands. Now, as I've been in the profession a little longer, I don't get to go outside and do fun stuff as much. I do a little bit more managing of people, writing environmental assessments and whatnot. And I really love the chance to get to teach and train. So I teach wetland delineation. I teach Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol, which is our functional assessment I'll talk about a little bit. I do that through Maritime College of Forest Technology in New Brunswick, and I teach environmental field skills to Amazon in Europe. So online, unfortunately. So that's a little bit about my background. So hopefully that helps guide what I know about and the things that I don't know as much about. I work a lot with folks who design and permit and construct things. So moving into wetlands, as defined by the Environment Act, wetland is land in Nova Scotia. It's land that's commonly referred to as marsh, fen, swamp, or bog, and I'll get into this a little bit more in more detail. I don't need to read this in detail, but the 3 key components here are highlighted. So what makes a wetland is hydrophytic soils, hydric soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and hydrology. So soils, plants, and water. You have to have all 3 for an area to be considered a wetland. And there's a lot that goes into, this is a week-long course, how to delineate a wetland and how to identify them. So I'm not going to go into details on that but we'll touch on those a little bit as I go through. But it's essentially hydrology, soils, and wetland plants. Why do we care? There's a lot of reasons, and everyone has different reasons for why they care about wetlands. For some people, they care only because they're legally protected, and that's fine, but they're legally protected because they offer so many ecosystem services in terms of, recreation, tourism, biodiversity, support of rare species, but also, really importantly, watershed protection, stormwater retention. I mean, everyone remembers this photo down in Bedford a couple of years ago that flooded out our office. We're out of our office for months and months. So these are the kinds of things that happen more frequently in watersheds where wetland cover has been removed, or where there's less wetland, more built infrastructure, impermeable surfaces, things like that. So that's kind of at the crux of why wetlands are important in a quick summary. And because of their importance, back in 2007, we implemented the EGSPA, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. This identified certain targets for Nova Scotia to meet, and one of those targets was to implement a system to protect wetlands. That wetland policy was written by my friend John Brazier and finalized in 2011, which is kind of exactly when I started consulting. So I was really lucky to get in at the ground level of the implementation of the wetland policy. But its objective, in part, is to manage human activity in or near wetlands with the goal of no loss of WSS, and that's a separate slide later on, but it stands for Wetlands of Special Significance, and preventing net loss in area and function. So we're really talking about area and function when we're talking about wetlands, and this is why it's important to have a good wetland consultant who knows how to define those wetland boundaries and functions. So part of this wetland policy, sorry, that got snappy there. Part of the wetland policy is that there's a permitting process to allow for alterations to wetlands. Through this application process, you need to field delineate wetlands and assess their functions using Westpac. That's one of the courses I'd mentioned earlier that I get to teach. And when applying for alteration approval, the province requires that we demonstrate a mitigation sequence. So we can't just say, we're gonna plow over all of the wetlands just because it's easier to build a site without that constraint. So we have to show that we've, in a lot layout, that we've done our best to avoid wetlands of special significance, we minimize impacts to wetlands, and then that we compensate. And this little diagram I've used for years, part of the wetland policy is that to gain permission to alter a wetland, you can only do that if you compensate. So it's a pretty big financial disincentive to alter wetlands. It's expensive to assess them and to compensate. It's a minimum of 2 to 1. So if you alter 1 hectare of wetlands, you need to build or hire someone to build or compensate by building 2 hectares of wetlands elsewhere. And that's kind of the standard ratio. That ratio can change depending on what's in the wetland, what your compensation project is. So if you've got a really high value restoration site, like if you alter 1 hectare of freshwater treed swamp, you can probably get away with a lower ratio if your offset is a high value site like a salt marsh. I mentioned earlier that there was special protections for wetlands of special significance. These you generally can't get permission to alter except for necessary public function. If there's public safety, you need to build a highway, infrastructure upgrades. You can get permission to alter WSS in very specific circumstances, but the compensation ratio is a lot higher. All this to say that knowing the area of wetland in your site is really important, and having a good wetland biologist delineate that edge so you know what your constraints are and what your offset requirements are. This is a very wordy slide, I'm sorry. So about wetland alterations, remember those three key components of wetlands. We've got the soils, vegetation, and hydrology. So an alteration is anything that affects any one of those three components, with some exceptions. So I think on the next slide I have a point about how tree clearing, timber harvesting is not considered a wetland alteration, even though it affects the vegetation. The idea is that with timber harvesting, if everything else remains intact, if the soil stays intact and the hydrology isn't affected, then that wetland maintains its capacity to regrow that same forest. So short term, there's a change in the vegetation, but it still maintains its capacity. So a few exemptions to a wetland alteration, and basically we're talking about infilling, draining, ditching, things that remove the wetland from the landscape or substantially change the function. A few exemptions, a wetland that's under 100 square meters in size doesn't classify as a wetland under the policy, so you don't need a permit to alter those. It's not that the alteration is under 100 square meters, it's that the entire wetland is under 100 square meters. Federal lands have their own wetland policy that I've encountered maybe twice in my thousands of wetlands I've assessed. So they have their own wetland policy. Wetlands that are specifically built for wastewater or stormwater treatment. So these systems can eventually develop wetland conditions. Those are not considered a wetland under the policy. Similarly, those created in uplands for compensation purposes. There's also an Agricultural Marshlands Act that defines certain agricultural lands as agricultural marshlands, but not wetlands. Not something I've encountered a lot. Same with the agricultural drainage ditches. And any wetland that has developed as unintended consequence of human development within the last 20 years. So something, let's say someone builds a road and they don't install proper drainage across, and you've got wetland building up on the upslope side of that road. If that's happened within the last 20 years and that leads to the development of wetland conditions, that is not protected under the policy. Similarly, we've got, emergency maintenance and wetlands that develop in between highway lanes. Those aren't counted in the policy. I'd mentioned the timber harvesting already, and the one that pops up more often than anything else that I wanted to highlight for you guys is there is an exemption in the policy for linear developments that are less than 10 meters wide. So this is really trying to allow forestry roads to be built through common wetland types. So if it's less than 10 meters wide and less than 600 meters squared in total area, through shrubbed or wooded swamps only that are not classified as a WSS. Those you don't need a permit to build a road. So it's similar to, if someone wants to build a driveway through a treed swamp or a shrub swamp, they can just go ahead and do that as long as they stick to that 10 meter wide, 600 square meters total. So I'm going to talk about wetland types in a bit, but really to understand this, the biggest differentiation you need to pay attention to is the treed or shrub swamps versus everything else. So a few takeaways here. The area matters. Area matters when it comes to this exemption, to the exemption of the under 100 square meters. It matters hugely for compensation. And and that offsetting ratio. And this is why that ability to have someone walk that edge and confidently say where the edges of your wetlands are is a really key component to any site design. And that's the same whether you're talking about, installing a septic system or building a mall or building a wind power project or a gold mine. It's the same across the board. Wetland type matters, and wetlands of special significance really matter as well. On wetlands of special significance, these are pretty clearly defined in the policy, and for the most part, they haven't changed, although through the years, each wetland specialist has interpreted these a teensy bit differently. So depending on the time, there's sometimes little nuances here. But all salt marshes, easy, WSS across the board. Then there's certain lands. So if the area is protected, designated as a Ramsar site, provincial wildlife management area, provincial parks, wilderness areas, those are all designated as WSSs based on that protection of the land overall. And there's, again, nuances there. So, oh my gosh, I can't think of the name of this. No, forget it. No, I'll think of it later. Intact or restored wetlands that are under management of the Eastern Habitat Joint Venture or waterfowl management plans. There's a few of them in the province. Those are all WSS. Wetlands, this one's super complicated. Known to support at-risk species designated under the Federal Species at Risk Act and the Endangered Species Act. So at-risk is known to support is really tricky, and at-risk is also tricky because there's different levels of protection for species under those acts. So if there's any concern for rare species, you got to talk to someone who knows their stuff really well. And wetlands in designated protected water areas under Section 106 of the Environment Act. Those wetlands are all going to be counted as WSS. So this has been pretty clear, like I said, with different wetland specialists. There's been slight variations in the interpretation of this over the years. But last year, I guess a year and a half ago, there was a CBC article that basically announced changes to the wetland policy and WSS determination. They said it was routine clarifications of these points, but they were substantial changes in some ways. One of the clarifications, for instance, was, if you've got a wetland that straddles a provincial park and private land, they clarified that only the portion that's within the provincial park is WSS, but the remaining portion of the wetland outside is not WSS. So that's a simple clarification. But then there's a few other clarifications that were made in that article, and it wasn't really officially announced by the province, and it was even a bit of a surprise to the wetland specialists, that they, there's clarifications on when you can get permission to alter a WSS. It used to be just necessary public function, and now they've added, or this guidance has added, the article, CBC News article has added a bit about allowances for housing or for business development and things like that. So anyway, it's all a little fuzzy still. There hasn't been an official guidance on that, so those nuances are not nailed down since that article came out in 2023, which is why it's, if you're thinking at all about any WSSs, it's really important to talk to a specialist or consultant who knows the nuances there. Now, on to wetland delineation. I've talked about this a bit, but essentially what I mean is when we are walking through these huge properties, we're looking for areas that contain those three parameters: the wetland soils, wetland plants, and hydrology. We follow the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer Delineation Manual, and we're basically walking the landscape, and we find an edge where, our left foot is in wetland conditions and our right foot is in upland conditions, and we walk that boundary until we find our beginning again. We're flagging the edges, and we're mapping it on our GPS units. And what it looks like essentially in the field, we'll start with something like this. Oh, that doesn't show up great. We walk the boundaries and we drop points along everything that that shows that edge of wetland versus upland, and we end up with a series of polygons like that. So on a map that you get from a consultant, you'll see all of these wetlands, and this screenshot doesn't show watercourses, but they would be on there as well, because there's certain design considerations for wetlands alone, some for watercourses alone, and in some cases buffers will apply to wetlands and contiguous, or watercourses and contiguous wetlands. As far as types go, I'm going to lump bogs and fens together. These are both peatland systems, so they are wetland systems that are formed by the accumulation of sphagnum mosses. They are really nutrient-poor environments. They don't have that mineral soil with all those nutrients in it. And they're typically anoxic, so there's not a lot of oxygen in the soils. And this is one of the cool adaptations that someone pointed out to me once. It makes perfect sense. This is where you find insectivorous plants like pitcher plant and sundew. So these plants have adapted a new strategy for getting their nutrients by eating insects, where the soil is so nutrient poor they don't get those nutrients that they need from the soil. The key differentiation between these two types is hydrology. So bogs tend to be isolated systems purely driven by rainwater. There's not a lot of through flow watercourses, and usually not a watercourse outlet. Whereas fens usually have a surface water influence. So you'll see these, this would be, this is the photo in the middle and the right, where you have the boggy type vegetation on the edge of a watercourse. And it doesn't have to be a big, beautiful watercourse like those two. But either way, sphagnum dominated, tend not to have large woody vegetation in them. Often they'll have a treed fringe, but in the center, often pretty low vegetation, low shrubby vegetation, but organic soil and not, substantial tree cover. For marshes, our soil type is different. We have mineral soils, and the hydrology is more of a driver. We have more standing water, and often you'll see marshes at the edges of lakes or ponds, or at the edges of the ocean, so our salt marshes would fall into this category as well. The biggest key here is they're really dominated by graminoid or grass-like plants. This is where you'll see your cattails, your reed grasses, all of these emergent vegetation types, but you won't really see substantial shrubby or woody vegetation. The differentiation between salt marsh and freshwater marsh is really based on knowing your grass species. So it's a really important line to draw. I did a wetland alteration application for a levee in Peggy's Cove a couple years ago, and it was partially freshwater marsh and partially salt marsh. So our provincial wetland specialist ended up coming out to that site with me to make sure he agreed on the line I drew between those two wetland types, because he knew it wasn't likely that I'd get approval to build that structure if it was in the salt marsh. We'd have to reconsider that design. And then this is the one that matters for that linear exemption that I talked about earlier. So treed swamps and shrub swamps. These are mineral soil wetlands. However, sometimes if you've got shallow bedrock and just a little bit of soil on top of bedrock, you can have swamps that aren't deep enough to have mineral soil. So sometimes it's just organic soils over rock. But the key criteria here is the presence and really dominance of woody vegetation. So your tall shrubs, your alders, and trees. These are the driest of our wetlands that you won't see standing water in them, except for maybe in little pits and mounds, little hummocks and hollows in the substrate. They're easier to miss because when you say wetland, people picture marsh. And this doesn't look at all like a marsh, but they are by far our most common wetland type in the province. And they're the drier ones and the easier ones to miss. Because they're the most abundant ones in the province, this is, I believe, why that exemption for, a simple road was tied to this type. It's also, a road isn't going to do as much to the function of a treed swamp where there's no standing water as it would to a marsh. Putting a road through a marsh is, has a higher likelihood of affecting the overall water movement through that site. And this is a quick little summary. I'm not going to run through this, but this is a cool summary table that's on the provincial wetland website under Environment and Climate Change. They have a lot of really good fact sheets. So if you, and this is a screenshot of one of their fact sheets. It's just a summary of the 4 key types of wetlands I talked about. But if you have any questions about this, the NSECC website, there's a wetlands tab, has a ton of great simple information about wetlands, including these really good fact sheets. Okay. We'll grab a seat before we move on to watercourses. So my work with watercourses, when I was spending all my days delineating, I've spent a ton of time walking these systems and classifying them. And now I do most of my work in watercourses around the Fisheries Act and Fisheries Act authorizations. So do a ton of fish work. I don't do as much watercourse alteration anymore. So this is getting a little bit on the rustier side when you go beyond the fish and the fish habitat component of it, so bear with me if I struggle with questions on this. But essentially, the Environment Act defines what a watercourse is. It's the bed and shore of every river, lake, stream, creek, pond, spring, lagoon, or other natural body of water, and the water therein, within the jurisdiction of the province, whether it contains water or not. So that's the 2 key things. I should have underlined those here. Natural bodies of water and whether it contains water or not. So sometimes, it's, especially higher in a watershed and in the dry season, you'll have watercourse creeks, a bed and a bank, but there's no water. It's still a watercourse. It doesn't have to have water in it at the time that you see it to be classified as a watercourse. It does not include non-natural bodies of water. A ditch for a highway, forestry road, or agricultural drainage, or ponds created by humans are not watercourses. That's not as easy to prove as you sometimes think. A lot of times, we'll have a pond dug in a field and get questions from the landowner on what they can do with it. We end up having to bring the NSECC inspectors out on site and run through, this history of aerial photographs and show, when it wasn't there and when it was. And this is a little bit harder to prove. but it's in there, and we can use that and speak with our inspectors about what it means for our particular site. So law and policy on watercourses here. We've got the Environment Act, which is administered by Environment and Climate Change. Federally, there's the Fisheries Act, which is one of our strongest pieces of legislation. This Fisheries Act protects fish and their habitat, and similar to wetlands, if you need to alter fish habitat, you have to demonstrate avoidance and mitigation and all of that. But then there's also a requirement to offset for fish habitat. So I just worked on the Goldboro Gold project for years. And there's a large Fisheries Act authorization. To get approval to build that gold mine, we'd have to do huge amounts of work to find restoration sites that are suitable for the same fish species. And we have to build fish habitat restoration projects throughout that part of the province. Wherever there's an aquatic species at risk, we also have the Species at Risk Act that protects watercourses and the habitats for the species. And then there's a whole slew of other acts like the on-site sewage disposal system regulations. There's the Wildlife Habitat and Watercourse Protection Act regulations that apply specifically to forestry. It's our only provincial requirement for buffers across the province, but then some municipalities have buffers on watercourses. So if you were clearing trees for timber harvesting, you'd have to apply a buffer on watercourses, but if you are clearing trees to build a Walmart, you don't. It's a little, it applies specifically to the Forestry Act. So identifying a watercourse, this is some guidance from the watercourse alteration process, but if it's on the National Topographic Series map, it's considered a watercourse. That's a simple one, although sometimes, maybe 3 or 4 times in the last 15 years, I've had a line on a map. When I go out to the field, it just doesn't exist. Something's changed. So sometimes you can argue that if it's on the NTS map, that it's not a watercourse if the habitat shows. That's something that you talk with your regulator about. And then there's guidance on how to identify whether something's a watercourse. Does it have a mineral soil channel? Is there sand, gravels, or cobbles in a continuous pattern over a continuous length of time with little to no vegetation? Is there an indication that water has flowed in a channel in a time and rate sufficient to erode a channel or pathway? Are there pools, riffles, or rapids? Are there aquatic animals, insects, or fish? So you can flip rocks upside down and see if there's any invertebrates living on the bottom sides of those rocks. And are there aquatic plants? So if 2 or more of these characteristics are present, then it's a watercourse, unless determined by an SE. Simple, right? Except people who've walked our landscape know that it's often not that simple. We have a ton of these glacial erratics where we've got boulder fields that just completely mess up water flow across the landscape and makes it really, really hard to find. So flow regime is a really important part in identifying a watercourse because the flow in a watercourse can change over space and time, depending on the channel characteristics. So if I've got a channelized watercourse and then it enters this boulder field, I might completely lose my channel. I can often hear the water flowing through the rocks, and then it reconvenes in a channel further downstream where this slope allows that channel to be reformed. Consider seasonal flow regimes when determining whether something is a watercourse. And remember that we don't need to actually have water in it for it to be a watercourse. So in the dry season, you've got a channel and it meets 2 of those criteria on the previous slide, then it might still be a watercourse. It's just a dry time of year. And these systems can sometimes provide passage for fish during high flow. So they they're tricky and they're important. It's also important to know that sometimes watercourses can completely disappear underground, like I'd mentioned, for a certain distance. Sometimes I've seen 250 meters, a watercourse, like a beautiful channel, dry upland forest for 250 meters, and then it pops out again down below. And sometimes I've seen, not in that situation, but over a shorter distance, like, oh, everything above this barrier, this isn't fish habitat up here. There's no way they could get there. It's like, we should fish it anyway just to see. And sure thing, somehow the darn fish get up there, and we find trout in these watercourses above barriers. So it is really tricky. And one of my coworkers, her key for identifying watercourses when they get tricky is Cotton Eye Joe. Where does it come from? Where does it go? So if you are having a hard time identifying a watercourse in this spot, you got to move further upstream, see if it comes from a wetland or a watercourse channel further upstream. Does it reconvene as a wetland or watercourse downstream, or does it just legit disappear? So they can be tricky. They're easy when they're easy, and they're really tricky when they're not. And when I talk about flow regime, what I mean is perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral. So perennial are the streams that have waters in them all year round. They tend to be lower in the watershed. Intermittent has seasonal flow. And then ephemeral are the ones at the very top of watershed that dry out regularly. And maybe they only have rain in them, or maybe they only have water in them after a rainfall. This is a little bit outside of my expertise, so bear with me. You guys could all teach me more about this than I currently know. But I wanted to touch on watercourses in the OSSDS considerations. So as I'm sure most of you know, there are horizontal clearance and requirements or buffers. These apply to surface watercourses, wetlands, or marine water body, 30 meters. That's a pretty simple. This would be, your straight up natural watercourses as defined by the Environment Act. There's also this downslip ditch or drain that flows intermittently. And this is where some of these considerations that I was just talking about can come into play. Those systems have a 15-meter buffer applied to them. And I wanted to point out here, too, that the downslope ditch or drains doesn't only apply to what we define as watercourses under the Environment Act. So those systems that I mentioned earlier that are man-made, ditches, drains, not regulated as watercourses, they might still require a setback. When I was talking to our septic designer, she basically said that any system that conveys and concentrates surface flow, whether it's a regulated watercourse or not, you're going to want to account for that 15-meter buffer and work closely with your septic designer to give as much of a buffer as you can. Then she mentioned that there is a clarification on waterfront lots having an additional setback of 60 meters as well. And it sounds like maybe that's not as clear to everyone, or it was a recent clarification that was announced. Anyway, that's another consideration to think about when you're talking about waterfront lots on lakes and ponds. Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
That's 60 meters on the waterfront lots. That's just in the planning stage when we're trying to site a septic and do a site assessment plan.
Okay.
We are allowed to go 30 meters from any marine or wetland or watercourse in the province with our septic.
Okay.
A waterfront lot does not mean that you have to be 60 meters.
Yeah, it sounded like it wasn't super clear, but that's really helpful to know. Yeah.
It's more for like subdividing lot.
Right. And that's what she's...
Clarification on the book.
Yeah, she said that these setbacks are different depending on whether it's a new lot that you're designing versus an existing lot that you're maintaining or upgrading. I'll just finish these few points because it's my last slide, and then we can open up to all questions. But But that was basically it, just to be mindful of watercourse locations and flow regimes. And if you've got a system that's an intermittent ditch or drain that's kind of maybe falls under the 50-meter setback, maybe it's a watercourse. You know, Christy was saying that, God, if we're dealing with something like that, I'm going to talk to someone like you, someone like a watercourse specialist who can make that line. So work closely with your designer, and yeah.
Just to mention that this session is being recorded, and to get for the recording, we need if there's questions or anybody speaks that's not speaking from that microphone, there's a microphone here that we'll hand around. So if you just put your hand up, and we'll bring it over to you. Sorry, back to.
Yeah. So please, as I mentioned, that last slide is probably the most relevant to you folks in the room, and it's the one that I'm least familiar with. So I love the conversation. If you've got questions, keep them coming. You can probably teach each other and me a couple things. Any questions about anything that I've talked about here?
So we'll bring the mic to you. If you have any questions, you have a water course, wetland expert in the room today, so take advantage of Melanie with any questions that you have. So just raise your hand, and Laura and I will bring the mic for you. Just keep raising your hand, please. And just say your name and your question.
Hi. I don't know if this is working. Lyndon Crow. If you can answer, how accurate have you found the Nova Scotia landscape viewer to be?
It's good. We use that all the time for desktop reviews. In terms of wetlands and watercourses, those layers on the provincial landscape viewer were basically developed based on topography and based on aerial photo interpretation. So they're really good at figuring out where the bigger systems are, but they hugely underestimate isolated systems, smaller wetlands, smaller watercourses. So I meant to include, I've got a good screen grab of what's on the provincial landscape viewer and then what we end up finding when we walk the landscape. Sometimes 15 wetlands turns into 250 wetlands. So it's a good first crack, but it's, you know, it's not the same as boots on the ground. Yeah.
Is there a list online of qualified delineators somewhere?
There has been. There's actually a wet. I haven't looked in the last little bit as the wetland specialists and the wetland policy is kind of changing. There's a great, the wetlands website is great. It used to have, and it might still have, wetland consultants for hire. I just don't know if it's been updated or maintained or if it's been deleted, but during the break, I'll look that up and check for you. But if you're not sure, you can always just reach out to your local NSECC inspector, and they can direct you to someone.
And where does beaver activity fit into all this?
Oh. It doesn't really change. So that exemption for man-made wetlands in the last 20 years, it doesn't apply to beaver activity. So yeah, if it meets those three criteria for soils, hydrology, and vegetation, whether it was created by a beaver or not, it still could be a wetland. Yeah, the beavers are they're tricky for sure because, I mean, on the other side, you can get permission to remove a beaver dam, and I don't believe it always requires a wetland alteration application, but that might be a function of the department's not communicating on that. I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
hi, it's Stefan from Environment. Just, I guess, a clarification on the waterfront lot stuff.
Yes, please.
There was some put out, and it seems like it's gotten out to the industry. So thanks for whoever was reading that. Yeah, that is at the subdivision stage. So if a lot is deemed waterfront, it needs to be a bit bigger in the subdivision stage. In theory, though, during design, regulatory requirements are to meet the 30 meters. I can also clarify, I do not believe there's a list of delineators on our website, and I can remember that because I came here and said there was, and was informed there wasn't, and I went
There
to check.
was. There used to be.
was at one point.
There used to be, yeah.
At some point, it was taken down, so I don't believe that there is a list on Environment's website anymore. My real question was, I was just wondering if you could go back to the treed swamp slide. Like you said, it's the most common. It's the one that I see the most issues with. And I'm just wondering if you had like one or two tips for a non-delineator, like
Yeah.
kind of easy red flags maybe.
Totally. So, if you know a few trees, red maple and black spruce are really common in treed swamps. This fern in both of these, it's called cinnamon fern. It kind of feels like you're walking through Jurassic Park. It's often, I'm short, so it's often almost up to my armpits. And it's funny because that species is not an actual wetland species based on its indicator status, but every wetland delineator follows it to find their edges. If you've got like a moss cover that squishes under your feet, if you dig down and squish the soil and it's wet, that helps identify. And if there's really, really fine grasses, there's a species called three-seeded sedge. It looks like just little fine hair almost. That's a really common treed swamp. I just had another one. I lost it, though. Oh, if you see, like the trees are starting to, I remembered it. If you see the trees are a little bit more easily uprooted, like you're walking through a forest that all the trees are upright and then you get to a spot where more have fallen over, that's an indicator that there's wetness in the soil and a little bit less stability in the root systems. One of the tricks I teach our delineators is I learned it from a colleague in New Brunswick, is the GLS, or the green line of sorrow. So just sorrow meaning like, oh my God, we got to map another wetland and do all this paperwork. If you're walking through an upland forest, you often don't have a lot of like really bright green vegetation cover. And then you see, oh, down there it's bright green at the bottom of this slope. And it's all covered with this fern and sphagnum moss cover and that three-seeded sedge. That's a good indicator you're in a treed swamp. But squish test, ferns, red maple, those are kind of good ones. The slope is also really, really helpful too. Oh, I have a question for you, Stefan, actually on that 60-meter setback. Does that apply the same to watercourses and water bodies?
It would be water bodies, so like
Okay.
ponds, lakes, marine water bodies.
Okay, that's what I thought. It doesn't seem. I just looked at it quickly. It's not my area of expertise, but yeah. Okay, water bodies.
Does anybody else have any questions? Just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. We have, okay.
Hi, Melanie.
Hello.
I have a question on the linear development. To be able to create or infill a wetland without requiring a permit.
Yeah.
I understand it's if it's 10 meters wide, and I believe it was 600
Yeah.
total. We run into this occasionally, and there's always a concern that you might get in trouble doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a notification or a procedure or some way to get yourself, for certain that?
No, there isn't. If you're unsure, it wouldn't hurt to send an email to the inspector and say, this is what I'm planning. This is, this is where I think my wetland edges are. And often, often folks will get someone like us to go take a quick look at a site. If it's really that small of an impact, it takes us half an hour on site to say, yeah, this is an edge, this is an edge. This is a treed swamp in between. Based on this distance between these edges, you can build a road 8 meters wide or 5 meters wide or 10 meters wide. But no, there's no actual process to go through that. I would say just document, take lots of photos of the wetland itself. If you can have someone mark those edges, that's really helpful too. So sometimes people will hire a wetland delineator to just do a quick assessment like that to keep them out of trouble. Yeah, because sometimes, especially at edges of big bogs, like that table makes it look like it's really clear, but you also have wetland complexes that have treed swamp portions and bog portions. So if you're on the fence, it's best to just be safe and hire someone, a couple $100 for, a couple hours to just come out and document it for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. There was a group from Nova Scotia went up and took the wetland delineator course at the Maritime Forestry College.
Yeah.
New Brunswick seemed to have a process for licensing. Is there a process in Nova Scotia, or what do you need to do to call yourself a wetland delineator?
There is no process here. You see, Fern Hills Institute, Nick Hill, used to teach a wetland delineation course. So I would say we used to have to, it was recommended that you take this course or the MCFT one. Did you do that with Derek? Derek Mitchell?
I'm
Maybe.
not sure if he was there or not.
He'd be one of the instructors, but so in New Brunswick, yeah, they had like a list of approved delineators, and they used to have, I don't think they still do, but they used to have an auditing process where the regulators could come out, and if you did a wetland data point, you'd have to flag it and put your initials, and those waypoints would go in your report so the regulator could come out and audit your work, audit your line, audit your data points. There isn't really one here. I think consultants are responsible to make sure that they're confident their folks are trained. So for instance, we don't send all of our delineators on a delineator course. The province, like the wetland specialist, is confident that we are teaching them appropriately and teaching them the same information from that Army Corps of Delineation Manual, Army Corps of Engineer Delineation Manual. And that came up from, there was a time that the wetland specialist is someone that we had trained. So he's like, yes, you can train your own staff internally, but there was no certification process. Yeah. We talked about it a while ago. We had a wetland forum probably 10 years ago and talked about doing that, but we kind of lost traction on it.
I just want to mention we have 33 or 34 people on the webinar this morning. So I'm just going to go over to the chat box. If there's anybody who's listening on the webinar that has any questions for Melanie, put it in the chat and I'll read it out. I don't see any questions, so if you think of something, you can type it in.
And I'm sticking around for the rest of the meeting, so if you have questions that you don't want to speak into the microphone, just come chat with me. I'll talk wetlands and water courses all day long. All right.